but watching together as if they were in the same place. I think the little crawl at the bottom of the screen that gives us extra news, I think is going to be replaced fairly soon by a social networking crawl, where people will share their impressions from keyboards right onto the screen to share with the other people watching. I think one of the great killer apps, it's going to be such a great app, I think it's going to end up being free. It's going to be an app for people who record television through PVRs, DVRs, or TiVos. 5 or 10 people can record a show, and then the app will synchronize those shows, those recordings, so they can watch them delayed as if they're live at the same time and share their impressions with each other. So we're seeing this tremendous rise in screen time. We're also seeing a second, more depressing trend I'll pick up on. We're seeing the demise of print in its traditional forms. I'll focus on newspapers, but much of this is true of magazines as well. We know that 30 years ago, teenagers, doesn't matter where they were, whether it was Russia, the US, anywhere in the developed world, 30 years ago, teenagers didn't read newspapers, but started to when they got into their 20s and 30s. Today, teenagers don't read newspapers, and the evidence is clear, they never will. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, well, they just don't care about what's happening in the world. All they care about is what's happening on Facebook or Twitter. Nothing could be further from the truth. Around the world, teenagers today are more interested in news than any teenagers in the last 70 years. They've figured out that what happens halfway around the world can change their lives. They're just not going to the paper. They're going online to get their information. In every country in the world we are in, and I said we're in 34 countries, in every country we are in, when internet penetration gets to 30%, offline newspaper sales begin to decline. So India, where internet penetration is at 15%, newspaper sales are skyrocketing. But we think when it gets to 30, they will decline. The sad truth for newspapers all over the world is every time a newspaper reader dies, they're not being replaced by a new reader. Now, we've seen this for about 11 years. In the year 2000, I was invited by the American Society of Newspaper Editors, our big trade organization, to speak at their annual conference. Incidentally, 2 years ago, the American Society of Newspaper Editors renamed themselves the American Society of News Editors. So I spoke at the ASNE in the year 2000, and I shared with them exactly what I just said to you. I said, every time one of your readers dies, they're not being replaced by a new reader. And then I looked them in the eye, and I said, you guys have 25 to 30 years left. Figure it out. They called me dangerous. They called me an alarmist. They called me every name they could think of, except the one that turned out to be accurate. And I was not right. I was an optimist. Because if I was right 11 years ago that they had 25 to 30 years left, today they would have 14 to 19. In America, they have less than 5. I've watched the San Francisco Chronicle lose a quarter of its circulation in the last 12 months. I've seen my beloved Los Angeles Times go from over 1 million readers a day in 2007 to under 700,000 today and dropping quickly. In Australia and the UK, they have about 9 or 10 years. My guess is they have a little bit longer in Russia, but I defer to your expertise there. But despite all this depressingness about print, I want to get to another concept that I am incredibly bullish on, and I don't think this is hype, and that's the transformation coming from the iPad. I think that we could say tablets, but right now I'm going to say iPads. Because right now it looks like, despite everyone's best efforts, Samsung, HP, RIM, Motorola have had a year, and the only one who's equaled or surpassed the iPad in that year has been Apple with the iPad 2. So I may amend this, the topic of this, in another 3 years and say tablets are transformational. But right now it's iPads that are transformational. As a matter of fact, I have friends at Apple, and you know they get their heads cut off if they ever talk about anything that happens at Apple. But I have friends at Apple who have said off the record that they expected to lower the price of the iPad 2 by $150. But when the iPad 2 came out, they saw nobody had beat them, and almost nobody had even matched them on price. So they figured out, why bother? Why lower the price when we can keep it at the same price, and we're still cheaper than almost everybody else? So their plans to drop the price by $150 have been abandoned, at least temporarily. But when the iPad came out, one of the first things I wanted to understand, is this the fourth screen, or does it replace the second screen? I'm now firmly convinced that tablets replace computers. Our work shows that 4 to 6% of the people who own PCs actually need PCs. Computer-assisted designers, heavy-duty number crunchers, the mathematicians you found in the room, big writers, although very few people write in America. We know that only 4% of Americans write 2 or more personal letters a year. So we think only 4 to 6% of people who own PCs actually need PCs. PCs are not only, they've gotten cheaper, but not only expensive, but they become intolerable once you get used to a tablet, taking 4 minutes to boot a machine. If you're a Microsoft owner, 4 minutes and 1 out of every 20 times you get the blue screen of death. And when you go to a tablet and you turn it on and you're literally working a second later, and if you turn it off forgetting to do something, you do that on your PC. Most of us don't even bother. We figure we'll just do it later. With a tablet, you're right back in a second. We think PCs are on the path to going away. I don't know a single person who has an iPad who has not looked at their computer or their laptop and said, can I get rid of it? Some of them have, some of them can't yet, and we'll tell you why they can't. But the limitations for most people on the iPad are not limitations of the device, they come from the stubbornness of Steve Jobs. Things like a refusal to put Adobe Flash in or a USB port, things that could be changed in an instant if he were willing and more of an agreeable person and less of a tyrant. And those things will happen if he's forced to happen or if somebody else ends up running Apple. But if you look at iPads, first of all, newspapers and magazines were never going to do very well on the internet. Because the internet's a lean-forward experience. Nobody was going to lean forward and spend an hour reading the newspaper. They might lean forward and read an article in the newspaper, but nobody was going to spend an hour or two reading a magazine or reading a newspaper, leaning forward into a screen. The first person to really understand that was Jeff Bezos, who realized if he was going to introduce an electronic reader, the Kindle, then it had to restore reading to its rightful lean-back environment, the way people want to read, in bed, in the bathtub, at the beach. That's how people will read, and that's how magazines now, and books and newspapers are moving to iPads and other tablets in incredible ways if they do nothing more than simply take the magazine or the newspaper and put it on the iPad. The colors are rich and vibrant, but they have the ability to actually introduce interactivity. Scott had mentioned, he told me about this yesterday, Al Gore's new, we call it a book, we call it a presentation, we call it a Al Gore, well, Amazon sells it as a book, as a hardcover book, but if you buy it for the Kindle, which Scott encouraged me to do when I did, if you buy it for the iPad, it's an absolutely remarkable experience. Both of us have it on our iPads, if anyone wants to see it during the break. It just changes the whole notion of what engagement with what used to be print media could be. The other thing we think happens with tablets is the beginning of the end of the mouse. I was in Barcelona at the World Mobile Congress 4 months ago, and 4 people used the same example. They weren't stealing from each other. They just all had the same thing happen to them. 4 people talked about their little children going up to the television set and going like this, and then saying, "Daddy, why is the television broken?" Because that's the way you navigate. Not through mechanical things on the desk. Windows 7 is actually a touchscreen system. Most people don't have touchscreen monitors. And Microsoft, a company that rarely gets any credit for being clever or innovative, has come out in the last 2 years with an absolutely phenomenal device. If you haven't seen it, you should. The Kinect, the K-I-N-N-E-C-T, which is you control your screen or your games with your body. Now, people have associated Kinect with just a game device, and it is an amazing game device. Parents will never again have to tell their kids to go out of the house, turn off the television, go out of the house and get some exercise, because the Kinect is exhausting. If you move right, your characters move right or left. But they only put it into games because they had an installed base of Xbox users, and that was the low-hanging fruit or the easy target. The Kinect does complete facial recognition. It has remarkable potential for medical applications, for education, and you control it intuitively the way you expect to with your body. Another trend I want to take a look at for a couple of minutes, which has been talked about by Scott extensively, and I'm sure will be discussed all day, and I'll give you our take on this: social networking, which we think is the real deal. The first thing that has caused people to log on to the web more than to check their email. Now, we think which social network a teenager is in is a fad or a trend. Back in 2005, Rupert Murdoch, complaining that he couldn't reach teenagers through newspapers anymore, and they weren't watching as much television as he wanted them to, Murdoch bought MySpace for $580 million. And at that time, we had just released our 5th report. And I was being interviewed by reporters who were asking about the trends we had seen over the 5 years of our work. And then the last question, one of the reporters asked, it was sort of a throwaway or just an odds and ends question. He said, "What do you think about Murdoch buying MySpace?" And I said, I thought it was a great investment. That part of the quote got lost forever. But that he would never be able to hang on to the teenage users of MySpace. And Murdoch and News Corporation got really angry because they were questioning we were questioning their very reason for buying it, although it was a great investment. And they fought back by saying, look how much money we're making. Almost the day they bought it, they signed a $900 million ad share deal with Google, which just expired recently. They brilliantly marketed their Fox feature films and television series. They made a tremendous amount of money, and for a couple of years they owned a rocket that was exploding with growth, was the coolest thing on the planet. And then, as we predicted, not that we're always right, we were right in this one, they began to lose their teenage users. What we had seen earlier was the rise and fall of GeoCities, the rise and fall of Friendster, and we got a lot of attention when we said about 4 or 5 years ago that we saw that to a teenager, an online community is like a nightclub. And when the nightclub becomes too popular, or the uncool kids start showing up at the nightclub, you're out of there. And what's the worst thing that could happen to you as a teenager in a nightclub? Not literally the worst. That would be a bomber or a gunman coming in. But to an average teenager, what's the worst thing that can happen to you in a nightclub? Your mother walks in. Well, now your mother wants to friend you on Facebook. How long are you going to hang around a place with your teenage friends when your mother's there